A new Huffington Post YouGov poll reveals only 52% of Americans have even heard of the term cancel culture.
But despite those numbers, Congressman Jim Jordan, he's going on Fox News talking about cancel culture is the number one issue the country needs to address. Let's take a listen.
But if we don't push back on this and stop it and stand up, as Mr. Dershowitz said, stand up for the Constitution and the First Amendment, it will only get worse. And so this is the number one issue for the country to address today.
So Democratic strategist, co-founder of Northern Star Strategies, Michael Starr Hopkins, and co-host of the Realignment podcast, Marshall Kosloff, they're back to weigh in. Marshall, let me start with you. It's one of these interesting situations where obviously I think cancel culture is a real thing. Also, it's one of those things which is largely an elite discourse issue. And having Republicans kind of use it as their singular part of messaging reminds me of Trump being way too online during his campaign back in 2020. So what is your general take on this? Both the fact that half the country hasn't really heard of it, and second, that many Republicans seem to think this is a natural messaging issue for them.
Yeah, a million things to say to that. But one, I think the best example of Trump being too online really was he was at the debate. I'm not going to do the Trump impression, but he said Section 230. Right. And, no one's following that debate in that broader conversation. But no, so here's the deal here. The deal is mass audiences are over. So this is no longer, if you're a politician, if you're in the media, if you're on a show like Rising, the idea that you're trying to get 80 million, 100 million people to agree with what you're saying or even hear what you're saying is no longer a relevant idea. What really matters is, hey, are there 5 to 4 to even 10 million people who are deeply engaged by this idea? So for cancel culture to matter in our discourse, it doesn't actually need to be something that even 40% of Americans have to have heard of, because what matters is if you are a Fox News viewer. So that's why I'll push a little back a bit on your point that this is an elite discourse issue. No, I think it's actually a conservative discourse issue. There are plenty of, let's say, working class conservative people, aside from the coastal parts of the country, who think about and think cancel culture is their number one issue. But it's just never going to be that big populist one. So that's why you're just going to have, we're continually going to have these situations where politicians and media figures are going to speak to really, really niche audiences and not try to construct a broad-based politics for their ideas.
That's a good point. Actually.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, Michael, I'm like Sagar. I actually think that this sort of like authoritarian instinct towards censorship and, we got to push these people out of the public square and we got to fire them if they send out a bad tweet. And I think that's a real thing and I think it's a real problem. But if you're going to tell me on either side of the debate that this is the number one issue in the country, you have completely lost me. Especially, just look at the landscape of the country and what we've been dealing with. You think this is the number one issue? It's silly. It's absolutely absurd.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And don't get me wrong, there's certainly a lot of Democrats who take themselves way too seriously. But look, we've got almost 500,000 Americans dead from COVID. We've got people storming the Capitol. And the idea that cancel culture is the number one thing that the country should be dealing with right now is ridiculous. And it coming from Jim Jordan, someone who had allegations of turning a blind eye to harassment, sexual harassment at Ohio State, is even more ironic. If there was cancel culture, Jim Jordan would be gone. It's proof enough that there's not.
He actually did have to address that, and it's still a big political liability for him. But Marshall, okay, go ahead.
I would just say, unlike a senator from Minnesota who had to resign, Jim Jordan is still around. So,
well, actually, I don't know if that buttresses your point, because that was cancel culture in a way in terms of the Democratic senators forcing him to resign. But Marshall, this is my question here, which is that whenever these cultural center, these grievance things become center for the GOP, I saw Sarah Sanders actually mention cancel culture at the very top of her announcement bid for the state of Arkansas. It just obfuscates it obfuscates this, which is that Jim Jordan, at the same time, a vehement opponent of GOP stimulus, he's tweeted, quote, "The best stimulus is a job," as opposition to actual stimulus checks and more, is that they seem to want to lean into these rather than doing anything that might actually help them win their election. Is that because, like you said, they want to speak more to their primary base and to the Fox News audience, and that's just how the system is currently constructed?
Yeah, So two things. Firstly, I want to respond to you, then I want to respond to Michael on the cancel culture point. So firstly, the thing that's really tough here is that, and Sagar, we've talked about this, we've all talked about this with Crystal too, the most depressing thing over the past 2 or 3 years is our discovery of the fact that it's actually possible to meme a really bad faith version of like working class conservatism into existence that says, hey, rather than talk about corporate power in a serious way, rather than talk about wages and markets and actual like lived experiences, we can just say, hey, libs are elites and it's really shit, it's really bad.
You can
that
say
it's
it,
like
it's
that.
okay.
Yeah, it's really shitty that they're libs and everything.
Right,
But
right.
by the way, we're also not going to like pass minimum wage increases, and we're also not going to actually support working families, and we're going to do all part and remain libertarian in our economic policy. So this is just an example of how they're going to do this. I mean, Jim Jordan, he was the person who said the Republican Party is the party of blue jeans and beer.
Yeah.
And what's really frustrating is that it's deeply condescending to working people, because from my perspective, like, look at FDR, an incredibly successful politician that working people loved. He was not wearing blue jeans, and he was definitely not drinking beer. He was a cocktail guy with his two-piece suit. So the point is, it's deeply condescending to just throw these culture war things at them. But then secondly, Michael, I just want to respond to the cancel culture point, which is, this is the deep idea that does matter here. The reason why a lot of people on the right really get mad about cancel culture is this is really about society and who wields power in it, in the sense that when Gina at the Mandalorian tweets really terrible things and is like really insubordinate and frankly gets fired, which frankly, like, I think that was an okay decision to make on Disney's part. What people on the right are truly mad about is that in their context, they don't have the ability to wield the same amount of power over the left. So there is no conservative Hollywood place. There is no conservative tech company that could wield power and enact retribution on people. Conservatives look at what happens with Disney in China, and literally there's nothing they could do about it. If you're a conservative and you don't like what Mark Cuban did and with the Dallas Mavericks and not doing the national anthem beforehand, there is literally nothing you can do. So even if you wanted to cancel him, you couldn't actually do it. And that's where the actual frustration is coming from.
I think that's right.
Yeah, what do you make of that, Michael? I think that's an interesting point.
I mean, I think, Marshall, you are 100% right on that point. And it's why, Democrats mock Ron DeSantis in Florida and, him potentially being a 2024 candidate for president. I actually think he is one of the most dangerous Republican candidates in terms of being able to unseat Democrats for that very reason. When he talked about being at the Super Bowl and drinking beer and, it was okay for people to be out partying without masks on because the Bucks won, that resonates with people. There is a large sector of this country who is resentful of, ivory tower Democrats, and I understand that. And so I think, Democrats do need to be very careful the way we talk to people, the way we, amass power, because there is this kind of uprising we're seeing.
Yeah.
Well, and this was the core thing that Trump actually delivered on, and this was the point that Max Alvarez made here, that he conveyed cultural power to people who felt exactly the way that you described, Marshall.
Yep.
Gentlemen, so great to have your thoughts on this.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
As always.
And we're going to have more Rising for you after this.